This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and Surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast. June 19th, 1865, forever known as Juneteenth, the day enslaved people in Galveston, Texas were informed all slaves are free, and they had been free for more than 2 years. Today we reveal the complicated path that led to a remarkably simple military order that changed hundreds of thousands of lives, how Texas led the way in making Juneteenth a federal holiday, and the powerful performance taking place today at the Alamo. I'm your host, Emily Baucom. Today we are joined by Edward Cotham, an author and historian. Thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to be with you, Emily.
You've written several books about the Civil War, and in particular, its impact on Galveston. But one book focuses exclusively on Juneteenth. Why were you moved to do such a deep dive?
I've been interested in the Civil War in Texas for more than 40 years, and I've probably given more Civil War tours, and particularly battlefield tours, than anybody else. And I've given a lot of my tours down in Galveston, and there was always one place that I would take tourists to and say, here is where the event that we know of as Juneteenth took place. This is where it originated. And a lot of times I would take people there and they would look at me very puzzled because they really didn't know much about Juneteenth. And even though it was a very popular celebration, people just didn't know very much about the facts behind it. And so I started keeping a file on it. Now, as I say, it's probably been 40 years ago now, but I finally just got motivated enough by it to start writing a book to explain exactly how the events of Juneteenth came about, what actually happened in Galveston on that date, and what the effects of it were, up to the current time when we now have a national holiday.
And perhaps the easiest way to get started, like you did in your book, is actually look at what that military order was on June 19th, 1865. And it's only 4 sentences, very short. What do those 4 sentences say?
That's what surprised me, too, because when I first started looking at this, every year they would print the first sentence of the Juneteenth order, which just basically says all slaves are free. And that would be the end of it. And I knew there had to be more than that to the order. And so when I looked up the actual text of the order itself, as you say, it's only 4 sentences long. The first sentence says all slaves are free, but the last 2 sentences are really kind of embarrassing because they say all slaves are free, but basically you're free to stay exactly where you are, and you're advised to remain where you are right now and work for wages. You're doing the same old thing you did as a slave, but now we're going to call you an employee. And for goodness sake, don't come to the military posts, don't come to the cities, stay where you are. I started reading that. I said, why does anybody want to celebrate this? This is kind of embarrassing. There's a second sentence that talks about absolute equality that just kind of comes out of nowhere, and we can talk about that a little later. But again, the order is this very odd jumble of things. It says all slaves are free, but you're free to stay exactly where you are. And this one sentence about absolute equality. And again, I kind of went to work as a detective trying to figure out why were these sentences kind of mashed together and issued the way they were, and why in Galveston, of all places, in June of 1865.
And for some perspective, your research lays out the state of slavery in Texas over the decades. What were those numbers starting in 1836 and then taking us to the start of the Civil War?
Yeah, there were very, very few slaves in Texas itself when Texas was part of Mexico. So once Texas became independent, and particularly eventually when it became part of the United States, slavery grew as an institution. So in 1860, in the time we're talking about, slavery had grown to be an institution of about 200,000 people in Texas. And, that's almost a third of the white population as well. So it's a large number, and that number grew to be more than 250,000 during the course of the Civil War. So at the end of the Civil War in 1865, we have a population of intact enslaved people here in Texas that is in excess of 250,000 people.
So in 1836, your research shows about 5,000 slaves in Texas. 1850, that number jumps to more than 58,000. But by 1861, the start of the Civil War, almost 200,000. By the end of the Civil War, you're saying 250,000. Why the boom so quickly?
There are a lot of historians that have explained this away by saying that it was an economically viable institution at the time. That was certainly the belief on the part of white Southerners at the time. It grew from almost nothing in the Republic period, grew 10 times that number almost immediately. And if the Civil War had not intervened, there would no doubt have been many, many times that would have been millions of enslaved people here by the turn of the century.
Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, freed slaves. But in some ways, it was largely symbolic. How so?
There were actually two Emancipation Proclamations. Abraham Lincoln issued one shortly after the Battle of Antietam, and that's what we call the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And what it said was all places where the rebels are in charge on January 1st of 1863, all those places the slaves will be free. And then on January the 1st of 1863 was what we call the final Emancipation Proclamation. And what that did was say, okay, this is the list of places where the rebels are now in charge, and all of the slaves in these places are now free. One of the places that is listed there is the entire state of Texas. Now, that was not the case for other states. In Virginia, for example, there were some areas carved out where the rebels were not in control on January 1st of 1863. The Confederates were not in charge of large sections of Louisiana, including the city of New Orleans. So Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not apply technically to enslaved people in the city of New Orleans, which was one of the South's largest cities. So it was a very odd kind of a thing where you had some places where slavery was legal, some places where it was not. But as of January 1st, 1863, according to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, the enslaved people in Texas were free. But again, that was only words on paper. It meant literally nothing to the people in Texas because there were not people here with guns on the Union side prepared to enforce that proclamation until the summer of 1865.
And in your book, you make a case that the origin of the Juneteenth order lay in military events that took place largely outside of Texas. Why did the burden fall to the military?
The problem with the end of the Civil War was that it was not really a peace treaty in the conventional sense. Wars over in Europe typically took the form of a peace treaty where one side would agree to certain things, they'd give up some territory, they'd agree to do certain things, and that would all be negotiated out. Nothing like that happened between the North and the South because, again, as far as the North viewed it, it was strictly an internal conflict. And so that all that happened was the Southern armies put down their arms and surrendered. And that meant that things like the end of slavery would never be negotiated. There would never be a transition period between slavery and total emancipation. And that had some kind of unforeseen difficulties because you had a devastated economy after the end of the Civil War, and the entire agricultural economy of the South in large part depended upon the labor of these formerly enslaved people who are now employees, and yet their employers, the white Southerners largely, were devastated economically. It was a messy transition, and nobody knew, okay, now whose job is it to take care of the elderly people that cannot work? Whose job is it to take care of the children? How are we going to handle all these things? Okay, now these people are employees. What are their wages going to be? Currency is not a factor here. How are we going to divide up the crops? There were a whole host of questions, none of which were answered by the surrender documents that people like Robert E. Lee signed.
And in your book, you take us to different states across the American South, and you talk about how formerly enslaved people ended up joining the military in some cases, or kind of following along with the military because they really had nowhere else to go. And the military kind of had to decide, what do we do here?
Yes, that's right. One of the things that people don't realize is that there is a portion of the Emancipation Proclamation that directly addresses this and encourages the armed forces to take in people of color into the armed forces. And they will become, members of the Army and particularly the Navy. And they will do large amounts of service. And so at the end of the war, there are Black troops in Texas even before Juneteenth. And soon after Juneteenth, those numbers grow enormously in Texas, so that by the end of 1865, Black troops in Texas will be by far the majority of the Union occupation troops in Texas.
And take us to the events of June 19th, 1865, and set the scene of why the military is so focused on Galveston that day.
The military had been focused on Texas at the end of the war for a number of reasons. One, of course, was it was basically the last large unsurrendered Confederate state at the time. Galveston was the last major Confederate port anywhere. And so that had to be taken into account, and they had to get occupation troops in here. And to occupy a place the size of Texas, it would take a large number of troops. There was no doubt about that. They were also very concerned about the border with Mexico because the French had been taking a position down there. They had put Maximilian on the throne, and people like U.S. Grant and Abraham Lincoln were terribly concerned about what the French might be doing and might be planning to do to try to take Texas back or recreate the Republic of Texas as a buffer zone between French Mexico and the United States. So Texas was a very much in play part of the United States at the end of the war, very strategic. And so it was going to take a large occupation force to come to Texas to play on that chessboard at the end of the war.
So these other countries see that Texas is vulnerable. We can get it.
That's a possibility. And then, of course, we have to do something to occupy Texas because it is a large cotton producer, and northern textile mills have been idle during the war, so they want to open up commerce back to bring cotton back to northern textile mills. There are a whole host of reasons that they want to get Texas back online as quick as possible. They are going to basically recreate a government in Texas by sending Major General Gordon Granger to Galveston, which was the largest port, and he's taking with him a force of men and a bureaucracy that's going to basically be the capital of the Union occupation force that governs Texas for a while until the government of Texas can be reconstituted.
You write that it's a common myth that enslaved people in Texas did not know about emancipation before Juneteenth.
That's right. One of the real myths about Juneteenth is that enslaved people were surprised when the Juneteenth order was read to them or it was announced to them. Certainly some were, but not very many. And it's not just me that says this. This goes back to some very great research that's been done by other scholars, including Black historians who've looked at it, and one man in particular who actually talked to some of the very elderly people who had been slaves and talked about how they learned of emancipation. But the fact is that the enslaved people had a very effective informal communications network between themselves. And so people on one farm would talk to people on the other farm, and news would circulate through that kind of a community, just a mouth to mouth, very quickly. And you'd be astonished at how quickly news like that could travel. And so we actually have some accounts that show that Black people on a farm knew about Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in Washington before their enslavers did in the big house. That news had traveled very quickly. And of course, that's something they were very, very interested in. So that news had circulated widely. Now, it didn't mean anything in 1863 to them in the sense that it didn't give them immediate freedom. That wouldn't come until the summer of 1865 when the soldiers came. But it was, of course, of interest to them, and they knew that this was all going on. Juneteenth brought freedom in the sense that it brought real liberation. The Emancipation Proclamation was really only words on paper when it was issued. It took the men with guns to come to Texas and make it into actual liberation.
You touched on the owners. Did the owners truly not know about the Emancipation Proclamation, or did they conveniently not tell the enslaved people, or was it a mix of both?
The enslavers themselves knew all about the Emancipation Proclamation. This was written up very widely in Texas newspapers. And in fact, newspapers like the Galveston Daily News trumpeted this and said, look what they're doing to your institutions. They used this to generate a momentum behind the war effort, saying this is something that ought to motivate you to give all you have to the cause. This is an all or nothing movement. We've got to put everything into the cause. And so they made it a very, very important part of the cause. They circulated this news widely. They trumpeted it. And of course, who's in the households of these people that are discussing these issues and talking about the news? There are black servants in all of these big houses. And it only took one of them to hear this news and hear their enslavers talking about it to mention it to the other people. And again, that news circulated widely in the enslaved community.
Today, Juneteenth celebrations involve public readings of General Granger's Order Number 3. Did a public reading take place that day in Galveston?
We have no evidence at all that a public reading of the Juneteenth order took place in Galveston. My best guess is that that's just a misassociation with later recreations of later attempts to read that order as part of celebrations. But we don't have any evidence that a reading like that took place. And it wouldn't have made any sense because there were very, very few enslaved black people in Galveston on June 19th of 1865. Most of the enslaved population of Texas was in rural areas. They were not in the urban areas and certainly not in Galveston in June of 1865. So we don't have any evidence of any readings from balconies. We do know how it was circulated. It was circulated on handbills. It was circulated in newspapers. The Union Army required all of the Texas newspapers to print all of the general orders every day in their issues for months. So that was widely circulated, but it was not from any readings from balconies.
You write that despite his name being on the document, General Granger had very little to do with this order.
Yes, that's right. Again, the Juneteenth order is 4 sentences. The first sentence was actually written almost verbatim by General Philip Sheridan over in New Orleans. And he sent word to General Granger, when you get to Galveston, issue a general order that declares all slaves are free. And it's funny, General Sheridan put those words in quotation marks, all slaves are free, because he wanted to make sure that there was no mess up in the way that was worded. When the Juneteenth order actually was issued, originally it said, in accordance with the Emancipation Proclamation, quote, all slaves are free. Well, that's not a quotation in the Emancipation Proclamation. That was just a quotation that was in General Sheridan's order that was just put in there because that was the way it was worded in the order from Sheridan. Sheridan also wrote the last 2 sentences about enslaved people staying where they are and continuing to work as employees and not doing anything else but continuing their activities for the time being. It's only the second sentence about absolute equality that was not mandated by General Sheridan's orders.
Something I found interesting in your book, you said that this is one of 5 general orders released that day. I don't think people quite realize that there were just a bunch of different orders released that day, but this one gets national attention, you argue, because there is something in those 4 sentences for every audience.
It is. It's a strange order. You kind of wonder why it is that this order came to be so celebrated, because the first sentence just says, in accordance with the Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are free, kind of saying, well, this happened 2 years ago, so you're free. And the last 2 sentences are something that are really kind of embarrassing to a modern audience. And you say to yourself, well, why did people grab onto this order and start celebrating this order? And then you come to that magnificent second sentence about, what freedom means. And says that freedom means absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And that language is beautiful. And it's something that doesn't occur in any of the other orders that are issued by generals like Granger at the end of the Civil War elsewhere. It kind of comes out of the blue. Again, it's really remarkable that you have this language in a military order. This is the one part of the order that we remember today, and we have a giant mural in Galveston on a building that honors the Juneteenth order, where the order was actually issued. And the title of the mural is Absolute Equality, based on that second sentence. We know who wrote that second sentence, and it was not General Granger, interestingly enough. It was the only person who actually signed General Order Number 3, who was a young staff officer named Frederick Emory.
But as we spoke about at the beginning, those last two sentences, that's where you say there's something for every audience to get out of this. However lens you want to look at this, there's something in these 4 sentences that you like. What about those last 2 sentences?
What's interesting about those last 2 sentences, again, they were in there because of General Sheridan, and General Sheridan was worried that the enslaved people would start streaming into the cities and approach the army for military supplies and food and rations, and that they couldn't support those people. And this had actually happened up in Shreveport. This was not something that they were needlessly worried about. There was a reason for this. And he was also concerned that if they started coming to the cities and not staying where they were, the crops would not be harvested and the economy would further collapse and there wouldn't be enough food for people in the fall. And so that's why he had those last 2 sentences put in the order. The odd thing about that is, because those 2 sentences were in the order, it made the enslavers, the masters, want to read this order to their enslaved people. And so we have a lot of records of enslaved people who said, yes, the master had gathered them all together and he read from the paper, the freedom paper. Sometimes they're talking about the general order itself on a handbill. Sometimes they're talking about the newspaper, which they frequently call the long paper. But they said that he read the freedom paper to us and to discuss what he said. And then they come to that part about he told us that we were as free as he was. And that language, if you think about it, is basically sort of a paraphrase of the second sentence of the Juneteenth order about absolute equality. And so we know that just because of the odd way this order was put together, it meant that it would be the freedom paper that all of these enslaved people would remember being read to them. That's one of the reasons that they almost immediately seized on this paper as being the thing they wanted to celebrate. Because this is the thing, not Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 2 years ago. This was the thing that was actually read to them and led to their actual liberation in June of 1865.
Almost immediately, celebrations take place, but every experience is unique. You write about some people who found out and immediately left wherever they were working. Some people just decided to stay with their owners. Some owners had a hard time coming to grips with it. Just a lot of different reactions.
It is a lot of different reactions. It's a very confusing period. And it's a confusing period for everybody because nobody really understands how this new system is going to work. So now these people are employees. What are their wages going to be like? Can you fire them? Can you run them off? Can you punish them? I mean, this is an entirely new era, and nobody knows how it's going to work. Basically, you're seeing the beginning of sharecropping on a huge, huge scale, and it happens essentially overnight. And this is going to be something that's going to take decades to really work its way out and sort things through. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. As you say, we have reports of how everything was received at the time. Some people were jubilant, some people were concerned, some people were worried, some people were confused. There are a lot of reactions to something this life-changing and this dramatic, and we certainly have records of all of those kinds of reactions.
Since we are the Alamo podcast, there was a quote in your book from a gentleman named Felix Haywood from San Antonio, so that stuck out to me. as we are in San Antonio. He initially says, "We all went wild. We all felt like heroes, and nobody had made us that way but ourselves. We were free. Just like that, we were free." And then he later goes on to say, "We soon found out that freedom could make folks proud, but it didn't make them rich." So there's two sides to this coin here.
It is, and that's one of my favorite quotes as well. And I have a picture of him in the book as well. It's interesting. I went up to the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C., and I noticed that they have that quote on the wall in the museum, too. So I was really proud that we have a quote from a Texas man there as well.
You write that Juneteenth directly liberated at least 250,000 people in Texas and surrounding territories. That impact cannot be understated. But as we've seen, finding out you were free is not the end of the struggle for freedom.
That's true. Again, the second sentence about absolute equality was something that was more of an aspiration rather than a reality for many, many years. But, it was the first step along the road. I don't think any of the people that were freed on June 19th of 1865 or shortly thereafter were under the illusion that things were going to change overnight to where absolute equality was going to take place overnight. It was basically the start of a long, long road that in many ways we're still on today to try to see that the promise of that second sentence takes place. But it is an interesting step. I'm often asked, why Juneteenth? Out of all the possible days we could pick, why would we pick some obscure day in June of 1865 in some obscure place like Galveston, Texas? Why is that the magic date that we're going to celebrate as the holiday, the national holiday for emancipation? And my answer is that you could pick many different dates to celebrate emancipation. People were emancipated as the Union armies moved throughout the South. It happened in many different places, many different times. You could pick January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation became final. Although, again, hardly anybody was actually liberated on that day. You could pick December of 1865, well after Juneteenth, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified that formally eliminated slavery in the United States. But again, at that point, almost all the enslaved people in the former Confederate states had already been liberated. So that's too late. So what date kind of ties up the end of slavery? And to my way of thinking, it is a good date to pick June 19th because Texas had on that date the largest and the last intact body of slavery in the Confederate States. And that is when that institution in the Confederate States, anyway, finally began to go away. And so that's a good date to pick. I mean, we picked July 4th for the Revolutionary War date, even though, the revolution wasn't actually over for quite a long time after that, too. You just have to pick a date that kind of sums up what's going on and marks the occasion. And I think Juneteenth does that for emancipation.
Juneteenth has long been celebrated in Texas and became a federal holiday in 2021. What was the path it took to get there?
It was a long and tortuous path. There was a great deal of concern about the celebration of it, even while the war was barely over. For example, only about 2 weeks after June 19th, a black man decided to hold a ball in Galveston to celebrate the end of slavery. He held this ball, and it was reported in the newspaper that he had held this ball, and the mayor of Galveston hauled him in and said, "You needed a permit to hold this ball." And the man said, "I had a permit from the local union colonel." And he said, "No, you needed a permit from the city to hold this ball, and you didn't have one, so I'm throwing you in jail." And so he threw him in jail. Well, word got back to the colonel about his permit not being authorized. And so the colonel had the mayor taken in custody and put him in the jail cell in place of the black man that he had jailed. And to my way of thinking, it's interesting because I think this may be actually the first celebration of Juneteenth that took place. And unfortunately, we don't even know the name of the black man that was arrested on this occasion. After 1 year, June of 1866, we start to see the celebrations. And the Union is very concerned. There's Union Army forces in Texas, in Houston, and Galveston that are tasked with making sure that these celebrations come off without any major problems from unreconstructed rebels. And the one down in Galveston goes off without a hitch. The one in Houston becomes really big, and there are thousands of people parading down the streets in downtown Houston, and they're joined by the soldiers, and it all comes off well. And the local newspaper says, well, this is great. The black people have had their celebration. Now they don't have to do this anymore.
For that 1 year anniversary, there was a gathering at San Pedro Springs in San Antonio, which is really not far from the Alamo.
Right. And again, they thought, well, this is just a 1 year thing. This is going to go away. But that's not going to happen. It's going to spread and spread and spread. And San Antonio and Austin become really, really big celebrations. And it's not just the big cities. It's amazing. You could see some of these Juneteenth celebrations in little small towns will have hundreds and hundreds of people, and they will become really major activities for the community. And very early on, you start traditions that we still see today with barbecue and shared food and music and parades and speeches and things like that. It takes off, and it assumes an annual character very, very quickly and becomes a very special part of the community activity very, very quickly, and it will last.
I thought it was cool to read in your book that as the years went by, towns competed to hold the largest Juneteenth celebrations. In 1883, the event in San Antonio included a morning salute fired by 38 guns and a grand parade through downtown.
Yeah, some of them are enormous, and they'll start having beauty pageants. And if you see the pictures, particularly the ones like in Austin, with the carriages with flowers on them and these enormous, look like something out of Mardi Gras, it is an amazing cultural experience. It changes every decade. It seems like it's different. And that's appropriate as people kind of think back on things and what this means to them in this period in their lives.
In 1980, Texas was the first state to make Juneteenth a state holiday, and more states followed suit, but it took a little more than 40 years in 2021 for the federal government to make it a federal holiday. What was that process like?
That was a very tortured process. I don't think there was any problem with having a holiday to honor emancipation. It was a question more of what day that holiday would be, because other states were kind of jealous of it being a Texas holiday and a date in Texas. Some wanted to be, when the Washington, D.C. was emancipated. Some of it wanted to be the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment. There was a lot of talk about, when and how it ought to be recognized. But I think people eventually came to the conclusion that I did, that the largest population of enslaved people that was emancipated was on Juneteenth. And Juneteenth itself had become the longest and continuously commemorated celebration of emancipation and had achieved something special on its own. It's interesting that typically what happens is the government declares a holiday and then it is celebrated. Juneteenth is one of those things where the people declared a holiday, and it took hundreds of years for the government to finally come around and recognize the holiday that the people had already created.
Now let's bring in Dr. Jolie Rocke, a Texas Commission on the Arts Texas touring roster artist. Dr. Rocke, today at the Alamo, you are performing Remembering Juneteenth. Tell us about this very important show.
Remembering Juneteenth is about slave narratives from Texas. We actually speak and tell the story of Juneteenth through the voices of these narratives that were collected in the 1920s as part of the WPA, American Collection of Folk, and what was going on in the United States, so we could tell what a real America was. Formerly enslaved people were interviewed and recorded, and those are part of our national history in the archives. So I pulled those from the archives and created a presentation that tells about the story of Juneteenth and what it felt like to be emancipated and what was going on during that time from the voice of the formerly enslaved.
These firsthand accounts introduce us to the very real people who were impacted, people whose names we often don't know but should know.
Exactly. And we actually named the people who we say their names: Susan Merritt, Andrew Goodman, and the others. There are 7 narratives that we have taken extracts from.
It tells the story not just of Juneteenth, but what happened next. Why is that so vital?
Well, it's so vital because we don't know, we often talk about, well, if I was, there's a song, "Oh, freedom, and before I be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave." Well, that's easier said than actually done. And what we have to come to terms with, or we should come to terms with, is that when emancipation came, the enslaved didn't know what to do. They were just, an announcement was made that you're free now. That's like telling a 13-year-old, you can go, you're an adult, go get a job, don't sit by idly, go find something to do, get a place to live, and do all of that. Just go do it, and not give them any support, because they never got the 40 acres and a mule. They didn't have any money. They were told, you need to go find a place to work, don't sit idly by. That was a part of the proclamation. And they looked and said, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Literally.
There was no societal
And
safety net for them.
Yeah, there was no societal safety net. Many of them stayed on at the plantations that they were enslaved at because they didn't have anywhere to go. And that's how the sharecropping process started, which we still have sharecroppers today. A lot of people don't realize that. And so, how do you take yourself out of slavery, not just because somebody told you were free, but because you have all of the tools that you need to be able to take that next step and do what is necessary in a very racialized society at that. This kind of opens up people's eyes to hear this old text of people saying, where do I go? What do I do? Well, I'm going to go to Miss Mary's because she'll help us. Or I'm going to go north. Or I'm going to go down to Mexico because there was a whole Mexican underground railroad that went to Mexico, not just to the north. There's so much that we don't know, that we assume, but we're assuming from 20th century, 21st century minds.
Is there one particular story in the show that just hits you every time?
There is. Susan Merritt's narrative is very powerful. She talks about how after emancipation came, the enslaved, you could see dead bodies hanging all through the Sabine River because their former masters, when they ran off because they were free, they shot them and killed them, which it has a term called bushwhacked. And she said lots of souls are going to perish because of what happened. And the image of that, to walk to a river and to see an image of bodies just hanging in the trees of the river, that it was that many bodies that were killed, humans that were murdered because they obtained freedom legally.
What are your personal memories of growing up and celebrating Juneteenth?
Well, I didn't grow up in Texas. I grew up in New York. And we didn't celebrate Juneteenth. I moved to Connecticut for college and stayed there for 30 years. And while I was in Connecticut, I had heard about Juneteenth, and we started celebrating Juneteenth in Hartford, Connecticut. It was in the late 90s that they started celebrating it. And I didn't understand the concept, and it was just a party. And so they said, oh, this is emancipation when the, proclamation was given in 1865, 2.5 years later. Well, that was the first time I heard about it. After a couple of years of going to this Juneteenth celebration, I said, well, why aren't we doing something to say what Juneteenth is all about? Because we need to know the history and really understand it. And this is how Remembering Juneteenth was born. I went to the organization that hosted the Juneteenth celebrations, or still does, in Connecticut, the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. And I said to the executive director at the time, it was Olivia White, I said, Olivia, what can I do to, create a presentation or something to tell the story, do it at the Juneteenth Gala, so that it's not just we came to party, but we need to understand what this story is about and what our heritage is about. And she said yes, and they commissioned me to write a 15-minute presentation at the time for two people. It's myself and another young gentleman in the area that's a storyteller. And we had our 15 minutes on stage, and the people loved it. And we're still performing it today. It was in 2013 that I wrote the first iteration of Juneteenth. In 2015, I had an invitation to be a visiting professor at Texas Southern University, a historically Black college and university. And so I came down to Texas and moved here and said, oh my gosh, I'm in Texas. I got to go to Galveston. I've got to go and see the markers and everything. And I have to revive Remembering Juneteenth. So I expanded it into a 30-minute production instead of just the 15-minute shorter version. And we've been touring it ever since.
You last performed this show at the Alamo 2 years ago. It made the front page of the San Antonio Express News, big photos. I remember people coming up to you in tears afterward. What was your takeaway from the reaction from the performance?
Every time we do the performance, we have people who are immensely touched. Again, because this is in the voice of the formerly enslaved. This is my words. It's my creation in terms of the way we put it together. It's deeply moving for me to stand up there and to be in the presence of my ancestors. Coming to the Alamo was a very exciting experience, of course, right? Because it's one of the most traveled vacation destinations, tourist destinations in the United States. But also to know that African Americans were part of the team of people that built the Alamo. They were involved in the Spanish Revolution. We were fighting for our freedom to become at the time, the Republic of Texas. And so Black people were a part of the Alamo's history all along.
The Alamo is undergoing a transformative project to really tell, as you noted, that full 300-year history of the site. What special meaning does performing here on Juneteenth hold for you?
The Alamo, when I first came to the Alamo in 2023, I visited in March to just see the Alamo for the first time. And I noticed that there weren't many iterations of how Black people were involved in the Alamo. And I, saw two statues, and it said both of them were named people of mixed race. And then I went and saw the panels that told the history of the Alamo. And there were two statements. One was that Rosa Parks started the Montgomery bus boycott. And the second was Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech. And I said, those are the only two things that whoever created this panel could think of that African Americans were a part of in this Alamo history. Something is missing. And so I contacted the Alamo and said, I would love to give this presentation. And I was so excited and also surprised that I got the call to come to the Alamo. But that also showed me that the Alamo was ready to change and start to tell the story of people who were involved in the Alamo that they had not told before. I'm really excited about it, and I feel like I'm a part of that historic change. And I just, I'm very thankful to the Alamo for having me bring Remembering Juneteenth to San Antonio audiences, and really look forward to maybe doing some additional work with the Alamo.
Thank you to both our guests today, Edward Cotham and Dr. Jolie Rocke. Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We've linked to more information on Ed Cotham and his books, as well as more information on Dr. Rocke and her work with the Texas Commission on the Arts. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.